Have you ever finished a book and then been filled with that bleak, empty feeling where you just can't seem to move on, and sometimes it's even painful? That's a book hangover, and I feel one coming for me very soon. So in this video, I decided I should actually put my psychology degree to use and actually look at the scientific research to see if there's any explanation for the experience of the book hangover, and then talk to you about it. My name is Stephanie, and if you're new here, I make videos about books, writing, and reading. Welcome to the video. So Plato famously and somewhat saltily declared that literature and poetry is really not that valuable because it's just a simulation of reality that sways our desires and our emotions and has the power to change how we think about the world. If you're a fiction reader, you can probably agree that stories have the power to affect us on an emotional level. They have the ability to take us into new lands and to experience different places and emotions that otherwise we might not have access to. Emily Dickinson even wrote an entire poem where she says, "There is no frigate like a book to take us to lands away." Poet and author Jenny Shia also said that reading is migratory. It's an act of transport from one life to another, one mind to another, just like geographic travel. Reading involves an estrangement that comes with the process of dislocating from a familiar context. At least for me, the experience of a book hangover partially stems from that experience of being transported into a different world. But whether the power that books have over us or emotions that we experience when we're reading it and then we have to leave those things behind is problematic or lacking in value, that's something that we're going to get to. But first, we have to venture through the wardrobe. One of the first theories that I could find that tries to kind of unpack what the poets were describing as being transported into this other reality is called narrative transportation theory. Now, I promise this won't get too heavy. In his book, Experiencing Narrative Worlds, Richard Garrick describes how when we're reading a narrative or a story like a novel, it engages both our empathy and our mental imagery, our imagination, to be able to fully immerse us into the narrative. And that often by being transported through your emotions and your imagination, it can cause you to lose sense of your physiological sensations and surroundings. He's describing that moment where your tea has gone cold, the sun has set, you were gonna read one chapter, but whoops, it's 4 a.m. Current research seems to indicate that the more that you actually are identifying with a character, the more likely you are to feel immersed in that story. And the more twists and turns and emotional back and forth that happens in the story, the more likely you are to get sucked in. At least recently, most of the research that's been done on this theory has been exploring it in the context of communications and marketing. Essentially, how do we advertise to you in a way that makes you want to buy things? Or how do we communicate narratives and stories in a way that makes you want to vote for us in a political campaign? That's because they recognize the power of stories to sway our emotions, particularly our empathy. But is engagement and empathy really related to the experience of a book hangover? Every few years, a Dutch study seems to surface that people tend to cite as being somewhat explanatory for the experience of a book hangover. So what they did was split their participants into two groups, with one reading The Adventure of the Six Napoleons. That's a eccentric Sherlock Holmes British mystery detective story, and a nonfiction newspaper article about a current event. And then they tested the empathy of the participants before they read the excerpt, after they read the excerpt, and then 1 week after they read the excerpt, as well as measured the amount of transportation or immersion into the story or the narrative that they were reading at the time. When they compared the groups, they found that out of the group that was reading the fiction story about Sherlock Holmes, the ones that reported the highest levels of immersion also saw a significant increase of empathy, and that their empathy might increase 1 week later as well. And kind of an aside, what I found kind of funny or interesting about the study as well is that they found that people who were not immersed, that is, they were not transported into the story, actually seemed to experience a drop in empathy. So they were less empathetic when they left after participating in the study than when they first entered through the door. I feel like I could go on a real tangent on this, but we're going to try and stay focused because I want to loop back to the study in a little bit. But so far we've really just seen what we already know intuitively. Stories make us feel things. And sure, Being pulled out of a very deeply immersive story can be kind of jarring, and you might find yourself thinking back about it again, empathizing and thinking about a character that you really felt for. But at least for me, that does not fully explain the emotional fallout after the book has ended, because it goes beyond just an experience of immersion or even identification with people or places in the Grishaverse or Middle Earth. It's also specifically about Fred and George, Elizabeth Bennet, Nina Zenik, Piranesi, and Matthew de Clermont. It's about any and all of those characters that you loved getting to know through the story and watching them cause just sheer chaos. If it's a really good book, that book hangover can feel like you're grieving. And so, I found another rabbit hole to fall down. Our brains are incredibly good at simulation, such as using your imagination to create scenarios in your mind to explore the possibilities of a situation. For example, you might imagine yourself public speaking before you have to actually go and do the actual event. You might picture every step of the way, including walking up those stairs to make sure you don't fall. Maybe I'm projecting my social anxiety here, and how you might answer some of the audience responses or their questions. And sometimes, you might actually feel real emotion in response to things that didn't actually happen. Simulations or scenarios that you have imagined within your own mind. Fiction in the form of a novel is a simulation of a very similar kind. And finally, we come to one of my favorite pieces of research that I discovered while I was digging around for this video. This might partially explain why readers of the horror genre and the morbidly curious appear to be slightly more resilient to events such as the pandemic. Possibly because they already had the opportunity to experience and play out some of the worst case scenarios and feel all of the anxiety and claustrophobia associated with that. So in a lot of ways, they've been there, done that, and gotten the t-shirt. When it comes to the characters that we love, it is really easy to trick our brains into thinking that we actually know them, because the emotions that we feel for them are real. When you're in the mind of a character in a book, you know every single thought that goes through their heads. You know their fears, their secrets, their desires. You probably know more about them than they would even tell their lover. In the real world, with that level of intimacy, this person would be a very close dear friend, if not a romantic partner. So it's no wonder that we develop these one-sided attachments, especially over long-standing series. This is called a parasocial relationship, and they're actually quite common. According to Time magazine, around 51% of Americans have probably experienced a parasocial relationship at least once in their life. Now, I obviously have a very high amount of bias, but that seems like a very low number to me. Out of my viewers on BookTube, probably that rate is a lot higher. But for many of us, parasocial relationships are at the core of a book hangover, especially when it comes to the emptiness and the sadness that we feel. Because it's not just returning to our real lives, it's the end of a relationship. We're grieving. It's like a breakup. And that's actually what they call it. It's called a parasocial breakup. In fact, one study found that imagining the loss of a parasocial friendship, that is a fictional character, can create feelings of emotional distress that are very close to a real breakup of a friendship or romantic partner. There are also reports that the strength of the bond that you have with that character tends to be proportional to the amount of emotional distress that you feel once they're gone. This sadness and grief can even cause anger. This experience doesn't only happen when your favorite TV show or your book series comes to an end, but there's even a temporary version of this, where if you read the most recent release of a book in a series and you have to wait 3 or 4 years before you get the next one, that can feel pretty devastating. There's a huge gap where we don't really get any time with those characters. But it's not all negatives, because there are some really interesting and really great things that can come out of these relationships too. For example, a lot of people who have parasocial relationships with fictional characters tend to see an increase in self-esteem and a reduced experience of loneliness, which partially explains why so many of us came back to reading during the pandemic and even to BookTube during the pandemic. And similar to the study that I mentioned before about empathy, parasocial relationships can play a pretty important role in changing how you feel about things. Despite Plato not being very impressed with how these things can sway our emotions, one study found that when a character discloses a mental health condition that the reader or viewer is particularly attached to, that can actually see a reduction in the stigma or level of prejudice that's associated with that mental health condition through their relationship to this fictional character. Similarly, in other studies, we've seen reduction in prejudice against minority groups of all kinds, including the LGBTQ community, simply by developing a relationship with a character on the page. But this also highlights the importance of having diversity in publishing and the type of stories that we're choosing to take in. So obviously I'm biased, and there can be some pretty negative outcomes from this as well. But overall, it seems like parasocial relationships actually have a lot to offer the reader. This is part of what makes reading so powerful and genuinely pleasurable in the first place. Otherwise, I don't think that we would have so many different TikTok videos going around that are suggesting books based on the best book boyfriends or books that made me cry. I briefly mentioned how fandom can produce some pretty crazy stuff. Through the connection to books and these characters that we so love, we also are able to connect with each other and bond with real life humans and continue to enjoy some of the benefits of having social relationships among one another as well. So what should I do about my book hangover? Well, I'm currently reading The Will of the Many, and I am not lying to you guys when I say this is probably one of the best fantasy books that I have read in years, like years. I am probably 40% of the way through, and it is blowing my mind. I am terrified. I have checked like 4 times if we have a release date for the next one. I don't think that we do. I know that the fallout from this is going to be bad. So how do we cure the book hangover? Well, I don't know. Hair of the dog, just go back to page 1 and read it all over again? Well, one way that some people choose to cure their book hangover is to kind of delay that breakup in some ways by engaging in fan fiction. During the pandemic, we also saw a huge rise in people signing up for and just generally spending time on AO3 because it's a way to continue to engage with the characters that we so love. So if you know any good fan fiction for Will of the Many, please let me know. I would love to read it. If you have any tips that you want to share with me or anyone else who's viewing, please leave them in the comments. I'm really gonna need them. Because I based a lot of my reading on exploring my own kind of feelings and experiences with the book hangover, what causes a book hangover for you might not be the same for me. And if you disagree with me, let me know. But I hope you found this video interesting. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys again next week. Bye!